It was a pleasant Saturday afternoon, and Ivo Hugh was taking a train of passengers up to Lakeside. He enjoyed taking passengers, being accompanied by their pleasant chatter as he headed along the line. It had been an uneventful trip, aside from a couple of small stones falling on his cab at the tunnel after Krosnokuren. But, as they approached the viaduct, Ivo found he was beginning to have trouble breathing. He had to draw in more and more air for each chuff, and his speed began to drop. Ivo, are you alright?
I'm not quite sure, driver.
We'd better stop and take a look at you.
No, not in the middle of the line.
Ivo Hugh replied, recalling stories he'd heard from the other engines. Stranding passengers in the middle of the line simply wasn't done. Are you sure?
Yes.
The little engine replied, and he pressed ahead, determined not to let his passengers down. Gasping and wheezing, Ivo Hugh struggled into Reneus station. While his passengers disembarked, his fireman dropped his fire, then climbed up and peered down his funnel.
You've got something blocking your funnel, Ivo.
I thought I felt something when we went through the tunnel. What sort of something is it?
It looks like some sort of stone. Then there's a bit of a buildup of ash and soot around it. That's what's blocking your air.
Oh. Well, if that's all it is, I could blast it out.
I don't think that would be a very good idea, Ivo. It looks like it's wedged in quite firmly. You might damage your pipes if you tried it.
Ivo's face fell.
Can't see why I can't try.
You were thinking about that story with Henry and those boys, weren't you?
Peter Sam asked, from where he'd been resting in the shed nearby.
Yes.
I can understand that, Ivo, but big engines like Henry have wider and shorter funnels than we do. The fireman's right. You'll be better off having it removed once you've cooled down.
That makes sense.
The young engine's fireman climbed down, and Peter Sam buffered up to the rear of the train. I'm afraid to say, Ivo Hugh was still disappointed when they departed.
I still can't see why they couldn't let me even try to blast it out. I mean, if that stone fell in, it could come out again.
Peter Sam took a moment before replying, to consider his words.
Our crews, there's a sort of duty of care between an engine and their crew, Ivo. They look after us, and we look after them. The fireman was just looking out for you, to make sure you didn't get damaged.
I see.
You're 13 years old, Ivo. I know you've had a fair bit of experience in that time, but your crews have been around longer and they are more experienced. If I were you, I would take full advantage of that.
Good point. Thank you, Peter Sam.
You're welcome, Ivo.
A short while later, the two engines had completed their run. Peter Sam shunted Ivo Hugh into the sheds, and reassured him that the other engines would look after his trains. With that done, Peter Sam chuffed off to get ready for his next train. Once Ivo Hugh had cooled down, one of the workmen set about clearing his funnel. It took him quite a few minutes of poking and prodding with various tools to dislodge the stone. There you go, Ivo Hugh. You're clear to go again.
Thank you.
Ivo glanced over at the workmen.
What would have happened if I had tried to blast it out?
The back pressure would have damaged your boiler.
Oh.
Ivo Hugh fell silent, and he recalled what Peter Sam had told him. A couple of days later, Ivo Hugh was again heading up to Lakeside. It was one of his regular runs. Over the last couple of days, he'd been giving a lot of thought to what Peter Sam had told him. He gently brought his train to a stop at Reneus station. As the passengers disembarked, Ivo felt somebody leaning against the side of his water tank.
Who's that leaning on me?
It's just me, Ivo.
Replied the little engine's fireman.
Are you alright, Jim?
I should be. I just need to rest for a moment. I think the heat in the cab is getting to me.
A worried look crossed Ivo's face. Jim had been his fireman since day one, and he'd never had any sort of problem like this before.
Are you sure you're alright?
I'll be fine.
Jim climbed back into the little engine's cab, and the train departed a minute later. But as they got going, Ivo Hugh couldn't help feeling worried about his fireman. They made good time and soon reached the lake. As they crossed the causeway, there was a startled shout from Ivo Hugh's cab, followed quickly by a splash.
What happened?
Jim's fallen in. Ivo Hugh looked back to see his fireman climbing out of the lake.
Jim.
I just lost my balance for a moment. I'm more soaked than bruised, so I should be right to carry on.
Ivo Hugh frowned doubtfully, recalling Jim's earlier spell at Renee's station. But he didn't say anything as the train got underway again. Now wasn't the time. Much to Ivo's relief, they reached Lakeside Station without any further incident.
Jim, could I have a word?
Jim strode up to the tank engine a moment later.
What's up, Ivo?
I'm a bit worried about you.
I'll just take a couple of aspirin and I'll be fine.
Jim, you fell out of my cab. That's not supposed to happen, especially on straight and level track. I know you have people called doctors who fix you up when you're not well, like engineers for us engines. I think you should see one.
Before Jim could reply, he felt a hand on his shoulder. "He's got a point, Jim," said Ivo's driver. Jim sighed, realizing he was outnumbered.
I suppose you're right.
You'd better ride with the guard on the way back.
Jim nodded and headed for the guard's van. Meanwhile, Ivo Hugh's driver strode over to speak to the station master. They'd need to arrange for a relief engine, as the train couldn't run with just one crew member alone. When they'd finished, the station master strode over to the other platform and addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am sorry to say that one of the crew members of this train has been taken ill. As such, it will not be able to proceed until a relief engine has arrived." "How long will that take?" inquired one of the waiting passengers.
Not that long.
Reneeus said, as he backed down onto the train.
Please board the train if you're catching it. We'll be leaving as soon as I'm coupled up.
The passengers quickly boarded as Reneeus was coupled up, and they departed a moment later.
What happened, Ivo? Station master said something about one of your crew members being taken ill?
Ivo Hugh explained about Jim, and Reneeus chuckled.
I've never heard of an engine referring their crew to a doctor before.
Well, I just remembered what Peter Sam told me.
And what would that be?
Our crews look after us, and we need to look after them too.
That's exactly it, Ivo.
Ivo Hugh grinned. Early the next morning, Ivo Hugh was getting ready in the sheds. A good fire was burning in his firebox, courtesy of the firelighter, but there was no sign of his crew. Sir Handel had had to look after his first train.
Morning, Ivo.
Ivo Hugh looked over to see Jim stride up next to him.
Morning, Jim. How are you feeling?
Not so good, Ivo. I did see a doctor yesterday afternoon.
Did he find something?
Yes, there's a bit of an infection in my inner ear. I'll have to be off work for a couple of days, so you'll have a relief in the meantime. I just stopped by to say thank you.
Well, you and David look out for me too. It's only right that I should do the same for you. I appreciate it, you know?
Jim smiled.
So do I, Ivo.
He glanced over, spotting Ivo Hugh's driver and relief fireman approaching from the office.
I'd better get going.
See you, Jim. I hope you get well soon.
Thanks.
Ivo Hugh departed a couple of minutes later. As he chuffed off, Peter Sam's earlier words came back to him. He hadn't really understood it back when the other engine had first told him about the duty of care between an engine and crew. But now, having seen it for himself, he understood exactly what Peter Sam had meant.